Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we continue, inshallah. Let's regroup our reflection. There was a number of different interruptions, but they were necessary and important. So I apologize. Where we were at is we were talking about the fact that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has had a number of challenges in recent times. And we were saying that this reflection is limited to the Muslims in the US. I don't want to get into what's going on in the UK and other places. But we did say that we were going to take an example of some occurrences in Saudi Arabia, and then we may add something from out of Egypt. But let's see how this goes. One is this, that in recent times, one of the Mashaykh from Al-Azhar, who's published in the English language, very well aware of a lot of the different trends that are taking place, and he's a good friend, was a neighbor of mine, also a teacher as well, Dr. Muhammad Rahawan, one of the faculty of Mishka University. We were talking about Dawah and certain educational realities that the Muslim community faces. And in that discussion, because he was in Saudi Arabia, I think he's still in Saudi Arabia at the moment. One of the things that came up is that Saudi Arabia, from the educational side, has instituted a number of different training orientations, maybe even in things like philosophy and how to address doubt and so on and so forth. And part of the problem is because there's a number of youth and people in general in their society that have been questioning the educational techniques, the orientation, and have falling into doubt with regard to their religion. Their religion meaning their understanding of the deen of Islam, not necessarily Islam in and of itself, but how it is that the deen has been communicated to them. So we always want to separate between religion and religiosity and the deen of Islam in terms of knowledge and so on and so forth, at least in this conversation. When I was in Cleveland, Ohio, I worked closely with Saudi students, worked tutoring them and so on and so forth, and with brothers from Kuwait as well. And during that time, this was about 6 years back now, Saudi Arabia had sent out about 50,000 students to the U.S. 50,000 students to the U.S. And there was brothers and sisters. And I'm not talking about students going to Malaysia, students going to England or any other place. Only 50,000 students that were sent here, and it was a consistent group. And there were a number of different issues with that. We saw in our community, and I ended up having issues with some of the brothers because I would give them a special da'wah. I was an Imam also in the MSA, and there were a number of different Saudi students that were going there, and we were involved with them in the community, and we would talk to them about transitioning to a society that's other than Saudi Arabia because of the problem that is related to, cultural shock. The issue of culture shock. So we saw these students on the beach. We saw them kicking it in Ramadan. Some of us would be going to the masjid and they're blasting their music out of the car and they're chilling in the downtown area. We saw them with girlfriends. A number of different issues. We even saw in the masjid LGBT Saudi in the masjid. And so that 50,000 students, hold on a second. That 50,000 students necessitates that there's going to be a radical change, right? That 50,000 students necessitates that there's going to be a radical change. And that radical change means that that society is in massive transition on a cultural and intellectual level. And when we look at what has been taking place before, within these recent years, we see radical political shifts. So I mentioned a number of different issues. That you have a number of students that have come to study different sciences. They're being impacted by the culture here, and they will be impacted by the university system. And that was intentional because they could have built a university system that they didn't have to send out any students, but they chose that route. Even though they had an educational project already in place, they decided to take that route. And their educational project really was about bringing other people, other communities from outside of Saudi Arabia into Saudi Arabia for study. Well, I already told you that Saudi Arabia had to organize a project to be able to dispel doubts and questions that people began to have issues that were raised. They didn't have people that were trained in being able to do that. One of the major issues in the Salafi Dawah, in my opinion, and I put that in quotations, is that the Salafi Dawah never really benefited totally from Imam Ibn Taymiyyah. And the Salafi Dawah didn't benefit in total from people like Imam al-Wazir and Muallim al-Yamani and Amir al-Sana'ani and others, or Sadiq Hassan Khan. There was a number of scholars, Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi. All of these scholars, you don't hear them commonplace within the realm of the Salafi Dawah, maybe with the exception of an Ibn Taymiyyah and the others maybe here and there. But these are scholars that the Salafis will try to appropriate for themselves, grounded in the way of the Muhaddith, but also having an understanding of where it is that other scholars are at. And being grounded in more than just the sciences of hadith. They're grounded in a number of different sciences, and that's why Sadiq Hassan Khan wrote the book Abjad al-Ulum. And there you begin to see that he's talking about different branches of knowledge. Anything from mathematics to geometry to history to geography to geology to hadith sciences to tafsir to the Arabic language to usul al-fiqh to aqidah, to a number of different sciences, history. And that's an indication that there's a trend in the Salafi world, right, in that realm, which really opens up to much more than just the teachings of Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab. The Saudi Arabian scene on a knowledge base was really developed by the Egyptians for many years. And then when their educational scene grew to a certain point, they began to bounce out the Egyptians, because the Egyptians are known for producing educators. And on certain things, the Saudis grew, and other things they didn't. If you listen or if you even pose the question to Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Khudair, because he himself has said this himself, that within the context of Saudi Arabia, they were deficient heavily in the Quran. You can find classes in a number of different areas, and in the Quran, a heavy deficiency. If you ask Sheikh Nabil al-Jawhari, from the scholars of Tafsir, he's one of the top scholars of Tafsir in Al-Azhar, he will make a similar argument, except he would add that, and he was one of my teachers, that Saudi Arabia is deficient in a real in-depth understanding of the Arabic language. They're not known for really producing Arabic scholars in the way that you look at other places in the Muslim world. They go up to a certain point in knowledge, because what happens is that there's a lot of philosophical stuff that's involved, and Saudi Arabia has improved a lot on a lot of issues in that regard. But the educational backdrop is one in which there's a lot of deficiencies. If you really pay attention, there is not much that is being done in other areas in other sciences. And this is one of the reasons why there's been so much concern about the future of Saudi Arabia, and there has been so many transformations and changes that have come about politically. And that's because they're worried economically about where they're going to stand when all these transformations in the oil sector goes. The reason why I mentioned that, because if you notice, the economy is beginning to diversify, but it's not diversified well enough. Saudi Arabia was one of those places in which you have a number of hospitals with the highest degree of technology and no one to really use them. Right? And so there was a failure in their educational system to be able to deal with certain concepts and ideas and so on and so forth. And there was a tendency to really dumb down on the civilizational side. And that created their own problem. And people that take offense, I'm sorry, but this is just a reality that we're talking about. This is a reality that we're talking about. It was the Egyptians. They had to come to the Egyptians to develop their legal system, because for a long time they had claimed that their legal system was the Quran and the Sunnah. And then they ran into a problem when they came to dealing with international issues and so on and so forth. And the Muslim world has this problem overall, that there is a decline on the educational level. I was tutoring students from Kuwait that ended up going into high places in government. And in tutoring, you begin to see a lot of things. And I was dealing with law students in that regard that were dealing with business law and trade law and patent law and all that. And they're pretty much just using, American law, not their own law. And they, on a lot of these trade deals that are going on, or patent issues. And that deals with creativity and innovation and all that. And so a lot of times what's going on is just a lot of copying. There's not real innovation coming out of the Muslim world on the material level. And so that has created a certain type of student of knowledge. And that has created one in which for a long time we have not been able to get that student of knowledge to be grounded in having the tools that are necessary for building a community, outside of just talking about hadith in the Quran and whether this hadith is sound in this point in Aqidah, that point in Aqidah, beyond whatever limitations are there. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillahi. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أحوالنا وفي أفعالنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر لذنوب أنت Amma ba'd. We wanted to continue the reflection with regard to the Salafi Dawah in the US and the need to engage in some major adjustments if the Salafi Dawah is to survive. We were talking before about the context of the Saudi Arabian situation, and we were mentioning how Saudi Arabia has now found itself in a contradiction of sorts, in that its own youth, after a period of time, are beginning to question the deen. And so there was some adjustments that were made to how people are being trained. There's certain programs that are being generated in order to prepare people to really deal with the challenges that they're facing. And we talked about my experience in dealing with Saudi youth in the American context and how, they were struggling, and they didn't go into a lot of detail about that. But we also mentioned that some years back there was about 50,000 students who came to the US to study. And by implication, what that will mean is that Saudi Arabia itself is going to change, because when you have 50,000 students just here alone in the US, not looking at other places in the world, and they're sitting in the US for, anywhere from 4 to 7 years at a time, there's going to be radical cultural changes. So Saudi Arabia itself is going through a lot of cultural changes, and they're trying to adjust, so on and so forth, so that they're able to speak to those struggles that they have. Whether they have accomplished that or whether they will be able to accomplish that is yet to be seen. Now imagine that is taking place in the context in which the government has control over the educational system. The scholars have a voice, and they're still having those sorts of troubles with people knowing how to adjust intellectually and in practice when it comes to Islam and the contemporary reality that we find ourselves in. The Salafi Dawah in the US, for a major part of it, it was built around a few individuals who had some studies, and they mostly focus on Aqidah and up to a certain level. So that the Salafi Dawah never really advanced itself beyond a certain point. And we said that we were probably going to use examples from Egypt. Like, for instance, in Egypt, the Salafi Dawah has way more maturity, way more years, way more scholars, way more their own writings. And even with that, they had to adjust themselves. When the Arab Spring came around, the Salafi Dawah had to decide whether they were going to engage the political front or not, enter into a political party, run for an election. How would they deal with the political realities? Unlike other places like Kuwait and all of that, the Salafi Dawah there was not doing much amal khairi, like social work that was dealing with, doing services for the poor and so on and so forth. They stayed with other sectors of the Islamic movement. And so in the US, we see some brothers began to do that, began to deal with the issue of social work at a very minimal level. Intellectually, we see that there is not enough, like some brothers that they come, honestly, sometimes you listen, and this is not to be judgmental, but it's just, knowledge is what is knowledge. You listen to some brothers talk, and you start to say, you start to be able to gauge where the level of knowledge is at. Or the way brothers deal with certain issues, and you really realize that they're limited. And that's not really, the Salafi Dawah really didn't open up to that in its initial phases. Overall, historically. And this is one of the reasons why I said that the Salafi Dawah because it didn't take enough benefit of Ibn Taymiyyah, its intellectual grasp of things is very limited. Or even Mu'allim al-Yamani, or even al-Shawkani, or al-Wazir, or Sadiq Hassan Khan. The intellectual grounding in much of the Salafi Dawah is very basic and limited. And it's not even representative of the depth that can come from the Salafi Dawah itself. Although there's some real limitations when it comes to the issue of how do you build the community and how do you deal with social issues in that community and economic development. Those are issues that are not even touched upon for the most part. And if they're touched upon in a way which really is more about individual empowerment. It's not about the group empowerment. You understand what I'm saying? And so there's a lot of issues that come up to play with that. And so if the Salafi Dawah is going to survive, not only are they going to have to increase in the study of usul al-fiqh and qawaid fiqhiyya and become more familiar with people like Sadiq Hassan Khan on a higher level, Imam Wazir, Amir San'ani, even Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim. They really, for the most part, even Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, the understanding is very limited. In other words, there's going to have to be an intellectual expansion and a real study beyond the basics. And also, the whole issue of being open to development outside of just a conversation about hadith and a conversation about aqidah. The conversations that we have about marital life, the conversations that we have about economic development, the conversations that we have about politics, they're very limited. Even before, when we were talking about race about a year ago, some brothers made a lot of flaws in that because they don't have any grasp of the social sciences. And so the Salafi Dawah has to expand this curriculum. There's no doubt about that. When we look at Sadiq Hassan Khan, he wrote in mostly every field of knowledge. And he imitated Imam Shawkani in a lot of things. But he was a person that, when you study his books, there was a civilizational push. So yes, he was grounded in hadith, but also he was able to intellectually engage properly other groups. You can't continue to engage groups in a conflictual way, like we're right, you're wrong. There has to be a sort of exchange there that's respectful. And you have to acknowledge where people are right, and you have to acknowledge where you think that they're wrong, right? But that issue is a serious problem. You understand what I'm saying? At the end of the day. I don't agree that the Salafi movement, lacks its snad, because that's not necessarily true. It depends on who you're dealing with and what you're dealing with. When you start talking about the issue of isnad, that becomes a little complicated. And then what are you talking about? Because there's some that are very grounded in isnad, but the issue of isnad is not going to solve this problem. Isnad is not going to solve this problem for any group. I personally have isnad. There's a lot of things that need to move forward. The issue of critical thinking is one of them, but that comes back to not mastering the sciences and limiting it to one area of study. That's a fundamental problem. That's a fundamental problem that you can't. You have to be well-rounded in Islamic sciences overall, and that's why even the discussions. If you look at like a Ibn Taymiyyah and his type of exchange that he had with different groups, is much more intellectual, much more grounded, much more respectful, much more equitable, much more fair. The Sufis were better off engaging Ibn Taymiyyah directly than engaging some brothers from the Salafi Dawah, because then there would be much more appreciation for why there's differences of opinion. You know what I'm saying? But those, you got. That's why I was saying, without condemning, because a lot of brothers also want to condemn the Salafis. But a lot of the Salafi Dawah, how it was created and generated in the U.S., it came from some brothers that went overseas, and they came back and they began to develop. But they themselves were at a certain level and didn't advance. With regard to Bilal Phillips, Bilal Phillips has achieved something that most of us will never achieve in our lifetime. I don't personally read a lot of his books because I tend to study some other stuff, but Bilal Phillips was able to reach hundreds of thousands of people, with his school system. He was the only one from the American context that was able to build an educational system all the way up to the graduate studies for free, pretty much, or minimal cost. So we may not agree with certain things, or may agree, but we have to acknowledge where there is good. He put his money where his mouth was, and all his work has been to go back and give back to the community in that regard. Whereas a lot of brothers, they have not been able to do that. And he has a certain style, which is simplicity in delivering information. There's nothing wrong with that. At some points, again, you may have disagreements on some issues, but he was able to build something. But that's the crisis that the whole of the community is in, regardless what group it is to expand beyond the basics, is to be able to, even the traditional camp was not able to launch itself in such a way where it was able to ground itself in the U.S. and build scholarship from within the U.S. in a solid way. That's beginning to happen a little bit now. You know what I'm saying? But there were even internal splits within the traditional camp. When you look at something, like Seekers Hub, how that was back in the day, and the concepts that were there, all of these efforts are efforts that people are in the making. That's what we have to realize, that people are on a certain level, and then they're growing in the process. But that which we see coming out of the Salafi camp is not sufficient, especially because the Salafi Dawah, it tends to be entrenched in neighborhoods that have deep social problems. That doesn't mean that it's not in other areas, it's not in the suburbs or whatever, but some of the major Salafi hubs are in areas where there's deep social problems. So they have to move towards building people up and not having people necessarily focus so much on opposition. And that's kind of how they have introduced the Dawah here. And that's not the way necessarily it's introduced everywhere. Because when you look at the books of Hafiz al-Hakimi, he's not really talking a lot about controversy. His books are not written like that in controversy. His books is not a thing of refutation. His books are just a presentation of ideas and information with the evidences, and that's it. You move on, you understand, and you kind of build on that. They didn't have that approach. They came in swinging, and that was because of the way that they were taught. When you bring in Aqidah Barbahari and everybody is Ahl al-Bid'ah and all of that type of stuff, you just don't build a community like that off of the rip. And so that's part of the issue, is how do you get along with other Muslims? You're still going to have to get along with other Muslims. Even Saudi Arabia has to figure out what it's going to do with all of the people that, don't necessarily agree with the dominant school of thought, and they live within their boundaries, whether it's the Shia or some of the Sufi groups or whatever. That's just a fact. Coexistence is important, or else you have people just killing each other. I think that's part of the problem that religious people have a difficulty with. And there's a difference between being a believer and the whole concept of religiosity. I mentioned that on a religious people have a tendency of having a way of interpreting Islam in their own way. That's what we call fiqh al-tadayyun versus fiqh al-din. The concept of how you implement the deen. You can have a concept, I'll give you an example. Like, we had a case where there was a sister that was telling her son, don't go to school, don't get on the internet, don't do this, everything is haram. So now you have a young boy in the 21st century trying to figure out how he's going to function. Like, how is that boy going to function to grow up to be a man? But that's coming out of that concept of religiosity that she has. That's part of the dilemma. Her concept of religion limits her ability to think about how to interact with the world. And that goes deep for a lot of people. And that's fine if you want to live that for yourself. But when it comes for your children and so on and so forth, and how is that going to help them to be functional in society? A society which is merciless on a lot of fronts in those cases. You know, in order to get a job, you know, you come to a Starbucks or whatever, there's music. You know, you're going to be in the Starbucks, there's going to be people coming into the sitting area, they're going to be dressed a certain way. You know, that's just a reality of how we're living. You know, so how you function in those realities, a lot of times that's not what we're talking about. So the issue of expansion on knowledge, on the knowledge base, and going to a more deeper understanding, that's necessary. The issue of social services is going to be necessary in dealing with social problems. And the issue of how you deal with women's issues, that's just a reality. You know what I'm saying? You can't say that you respect the Salaf and respect Aisha, but then you say that your wife can't study. You know, we've had some Mashaykh that have said that. As much as he's respected Sheikh Abu Ishaq al-Hawaini, and even though some of the Salafis also don't consider him within the Salafi circles and others consider him within the Salafi circles, that's another drama that the Salafi Dawah has, is that they don't know who stays in, who stays out. You know, and so, but those types of statements, you know, that, you know, women shouldn't get an education, this stuff is backward. It's backward. And so not dealing with social issues, not building up intellectually, not looking at community building, you know, those things are going to be the major challenges for the Salafi Dawah. You know, and if they can't get those things together, you know, it's questionable how long it will survive. You know, and if they can't get beyond the point that all the scholarship is overseas, if they can't see any leadership among themselves, I don't give them too much before they start completely shutting down. Right? Not too much time. And these are similar issues which plague, you know what I'm saying, a lot of the community overall. Quietism isn't the Sunnah, because of the command to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. There's wisdom, but blind allegiance to a political leader on every occasion that you can't mention, you know what I'm saying, that becomes part of the major dilemma. And some of our brothers have equated, and I mentioned this when the Arab Spring was taking place, and it was my advice to a brother that is very close to me. He's starting to be a doctor, Egyptian brother, because he went into a crisis when the Salafi Dawah in Egypt became political. I told him, relax. That's your orientation. You can't just be jumping from group to group. That's another thing. You have to learn how to work through things. And you have to realize that people make mistakes. And so it's the same thing that was said to brothers with the issue of the changes that are taking place in the Salafi Dawah and the issues that are taking place in Saudi Arabia, that you have to learn how to separate between the two. If you don't separate between the two, you're going to have a crisis in your own commitment to Islam. And the Salafi Dawah doesn't always equal Deen. That's the biggest mistake that people have. Salafi Dawah does not equal Deen. Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, for whatever good that he did, is not a prophet. And as long as that's the mindset that people have without saying that, that's problematic. You can't say that the Deen begins at that front and then everything that came before is wiped out. And nobody in scholarship says that, except a few people. When I was studying in Egypt, there was a difference between bookstores that were inclusive of all the Islamic tradition, regardless of what was the orientation, and those who were just selling books that they say were within the Salafi Dawah. The amount of access that you had is limited. You know, that becomes an issue. The issue of going back to traditional Sunni Aqidah has its own problems as well. Just like going back to the madhabs has its own problem. we need to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. We need to go back to the methodologies of the scholars and understanding things. But those scholars wrote for their time periods. Even if you're talking about ilm al-kalam, it has its own limitations. It has its own obstacles. If you go back to the madhabi fiqh 100%, if you go to the economic transactions, most of that stuff and that conversation is going to be talking about trading slaves and this and that. And so that's not 100% to just go back. Like if we go back, is the solution. The only thing that we can go back in is the solution is the Quran and the Sunnah. Everything else is up for investigation and understanding. You know what I'm saying? But what the scholars teach us is that we can't belittle the methodologies of the scholars of the past. In traditional studies, نقف على مناهجهم ولا نقف على مسائلهم is the rule. And that comes from the Mashaykh in Al-Azhar, that we go back to the issue of the methodologies of the scholars. Now, understanding is it's not relative. According to whose understanding, no, it's not relative. Because there's some things in the deen which are just clear cut, accepted. There's foundational issues which are accepted, regardless of who we are, what group we are. And then there's other things that are open to understanding. And so that is negotiated with principles in Islamic sciences. And so as long as the Islamic sciences are being used, there's no issue, because then we can have a discussion on what is the principle that you're using to understand here. And so we may differ on how the principle is applied, or we may differ on a particular sub-principle which is used, but at least we know what principle is being used. And so Islamic sciences become a determining factor in everybody's situation. And that's part of the dilemma of some of the groups, is that they're not grounded in Islamic sciences. And so they come to decisions and you're like, how did you come to that decision? So it's like mathematics. Show your work. You know what I'm saying? Show your work. But the Mu'tazila, you have to understand that within the core of Islamic history, the Mu'tazila were a group that emerged to defend the deen as the community was interacting with outside groups, outside religions. So it was an attempt to try to engage others. So the Mu'tazila at the core, in their usul and fiqh, they follow the same principle as, look, the Shia, the Mu'tazila, the Hanabila, the Shafi'iyya, the Malikiyya, they all, when it comes to usul al-fiqh, they follow a similar system in usul al-fiqh and the principles of fiqh. The Hanafis have their own system, but is respected and understood in the world of scholarship. People may disagree with it, but it's respected, is understood, is recognized. At the core of Aqidah, everyone is saying the same thing. The usul of Aqidah. What happens afterwards is the issue of what's the debate. The debate is what kind of proofs do we accept into the realm of Aqidah. And then whether we can use metaphor in the Arabic language or not. And that really is what is going to, go on and have the debates. Those are the courses, the causes of the debates. Sure, because they had power. They had power, and they went to an excess in implementing the opinion that they have. That's part of the dilemma that is there when you start talking about power. It's not necessarily because of the Mu'tazila in and of themselves. You have people that have power. There will be no Ash'ari school as you have it now without the Mu'tazila. And there will be no Ibn Taymiyyah without the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazila. Let's be honest. Because Aqidah in reality is very simple. It's the issues that come up that are related to Aqidah that make the academic and scholarly discussions roll out. But the core of Aqidah is what the Prophet ﷺ brought in the Quran and the Sunnah. You know what I'm saying? Everything else is like a discussion on what about this situation and that situation, how can we think about that, or how do we approach this particular issue in the Quran and the Sunnah. But there's things that are clear and things that are open to understanding. You know, and when you have the keys and you understand the methodologies of these schools, then you're more calm because you know where they come out of, what the principles are. And it's not very confusing. That's why we have to elevate our knowledge. But when we're not grounded in principles, then it's like, you know, what's true, what's not true, this group, that group, this, everything becomes confusing. But when you understand the core of Islamic sciences, when you understand the core of Islamic beliefs and practices, and then when you understand what goes outside of that core, and you understand the principles of Islamic sciences and the reasons why scholars differ over things, you understand it. It becomes a point to disagree or not to disagree. That needs a good conversation with regard to. I would say that Ibn Rajab is very good. You know what I'm saying? Ibn Rajab's books are very good, but Ibn Rajab's books require some assistance. They require a teacher. You know, I would say that the 77 branches of Iman by Imam al-Bayhaqi is good. You know, as far as Aqidah, to broaden your view. You know, that Iman or Tawheed, Aqidah is more than Tawheed. It involves other things in Iman. You know, those are some starts. Those are some starts. The other stuff that comes along is more detailed and more detailed. You know, like I said, you know, a lot of brothers that were inclined in that direction, if they would have stayed with Ibn Taymiyyah, like the Kitab al-Iman, it would have been much more beneficial for them, because it would have been much more fruitful intellectually, and they would have had much more fruitful exchanges with other groups, more productive, more not so combative, with some understanding. But at the end of the day, you know what I'm saying, our focus has to be on the study of the Quran itself. And we should be taking our Aqidah from the Quran. The points of disagreement are going to come in how you interpret certain ayat of the Quran. But the Meccan revelation, or the Quran as it was revealed in Mecca, is important for our own development in Aqidah. Then the academic stuff comes afterwards. How this school deals with this, how that school deals with that. That comes afterwards. Imam al-Shawkani, rahmatullahi alayhi, he didn't have so much of he wasn't so anti this group and that group. He looked at people needing to be grounded in the Quran and the Sunnah, and then he looked at like the issue of ilm al-kalam. He looked at it as some things are right, some things are wrong. You know, he never took like that was the benefit of a person like Imam al-Shawkani, that he's respected by all of the groups. He's respected by all of the groups. He's even respected by the Shia. He's respected by the Sufis and the Salafis alike. Yeah, reading tafsir along with it, right? But more so becoming familiar with it, the Quran, you know, and very light tafsir at first. Becoming familiar with it, like with the background of each surah. Becoming familiar with the difference between why do we say that the Quran is divided into that revelation that was revealed in Mecca and that revelation was revealed in Medina. And to become familiar with the objectives of a surah and the overall meaning, the key meaning and the sub meanings. Because each surah of the Quran it gives us a certain understanding about ourselves, the universe, and Allah, which you're not going to get that in books of Aqidah. Books of Aqidah serve a different purpose. They serve to try to resolve an intellectual point or controversy. But the Quran, in the past, no one begun their study of the deen outside of the Quran. No matter what orientation you were. In the whole of the Muslim world, everybody became, yes, exactly. Lance hit it exactly on the head. Become familiar with the occasions of revelation and the seerah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even the lives of the companions. Because the lives of the companions, at least the major companions, they give you the context to what was going on when the Quran was being revealed. Like, for instance, who can tell me the background of why Surah Al-Ikhlas was revealed? Who knows that background behind it? Does anyone know the background behind why Surah Al-Ikhlas was revealed? قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Does anyone know? Even if you look it up online, look it up online and see. It was revealed. Yes, you can get the basics. You can get the basics of the Quran. Like, for instance, if you study Surah Al-Fatiha really solidly, if you study Surah Al-Ikhlas very solidly, was it the Christians or was it the Jews? The Jews had asked about the lineage of Allah. Umar answered the question. The Jews had asked about the lineage of Allah. And so the response came from Allah Ta'ala to that question. And that's important to understand, that a lot of the Quran is responding to questions that were being asked, real world situations. Right? Yes, they came and they asked. And that's important for us to know, because when we know those backgrounds, it gives us a different understanding. It's like, wow. If you look at, for instance, why Surah Yes, it was revealed because of a reference to the question of the Jew. That's the benefit of Ibn Kathir. Even though Ibn Kathir was Athari, he was a student of Ibn Taymiyyah. For those who may not be of that orientation, Ibn Kathir is very important because it gives you the ahadith that are surrounding the ayat of the Quran. Maulana Maududi, although he has some mistakes on some issues and is controversial on some issues, he gives you an introduction to every surah, a story of the background of every surah and the main themes. And you have other tafsir. You have Jalalain, and Jalalain is even in English. And Jalalain gives you like a word by word understanding. There's ways to do it that is not, you don't fall into controversy. You understand what I'm saying? There's ways to, but becoming familiar with the Quran is superior to getting involved in a lot of the academic debates. The Quran can pull you out of a lot of those problems. And where there's differences, it becomes clear where there's differences between the ulama. But see, at least you know that there's a basis. Well, they're disagreeing over this ayah of the Quran. It's not just that everybody's disagreeing and religious bloods against religious crips type of thing. It's because they're trying to understand the ayah of the Quran, or they're trying to understand a hadith. That's where a lot of those debates come from. How do we understand this particular ayah of the Quran? And there's two ways. Let's be real about it. One way is going to be that you give it an interpretation according to the rules of the Arabic language. That's what the Asharis do. And then there's disagreements about how far you go into that. That's one approach in the Ashari school. And then the other way, like what Ibn Taymiyyah does, is that he says, no, we accept it as it is, understanding the Arabic language, but we know that it's, like, for instance, if we say that Allah ascended above the throne, well, that ascension is according to the majesty of Allah. Some people can argue against that all they want, but you understand the principle. That's how they do. That's how they look at it. And the other school, what they say, well, we can't accept that as it is. We have to give it an interpretation which removes from our minds attributing to Allah human qualities. it comes down to that, people. It comes down to that at the end of the day. This school exists, that school exists. There's no need to, go back and forth. No, even with the now, because we're talking here, this is interactive. We're talking at a little bit of a higher level. But just teaching Qul Huwallahu Ahad, teaching Surah Al-Fatiha, teaching Surah Al-Alaq, teaching the Meccan surahs. There's not a lot of controversy in the Meccan surahs over issues. So that can serve anyone. Whether they're on the foundational level, whether they're in the intermediate level. Is the more advanced stuff comes in discussing why it is that scholars of Islam, regardless of their orientation, why they differ. Why they differ. And that becomes and then even in the Ash'ari approach is to just say, I don't know what the meaning is, and you just keep stepping on. That's a stepping forward. That's one school in the Ash'aris. There's another school that's taught in Al-Azhar as well that says that no, we know what the meaning is, and it's similar to Ibn Taymiyyah and them. But in any event, I don't want to get too far off on those approaches, other than to say that without having this sort of civil dialogue, the Salafi Dawah won't survive. You understand what I'm saying? Because you can't have masajid and communities divided on a constant basis. You know what I'm saying? Over how to approach things. The general public should never. One of the biggest mistakes in doing da'wah is when we confuse the general public with, yes, the situation of tafweed. And the tafweed, there's debates about what it means internally, but you can't have a community completely at odds with each other and think that everyone is a kafir unless you're with my group. That just is not going to work. You know what I'm saying? And that's where it becomes an issue. Yeah, and that's a point of debate. With regard to if tafweed was the way of the early generation and what it means, what tafweed means. But I mean, there's no necessity to go into details like that because we understand that those schools exist. The school of tafweed, and then the debate surrounding what it means, ithbat and ta'wil, right? And so, also another dimension with regard to the Salafi da'wah is that without any sort of program of tazkiyat an-nafs or purification of the heart or spiritual elevation, there's no way that people are going to be able to function, right? That's the dilemma. The dilemma is that what the obligation of the scholar is to teach people how to have a common ground. And then later on where people differ. When we make everything differences of opinion from the beginning. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When you get a chance, Ephraim, call me up. We can't continue to teach only differences of opinion and opposition without teaching people why there's differences of opinion and opposition. You know what I'm saying? Because that becomes an issue. But that's part of the dilemma of this issue. Betsy, what you're saying. Betsy's saying, I've met some Salafis who didn't believe in dowries, wanted multiple wives and polygamy, and were super strict. So that's been my impression. And that's part of the dilemma. that's one of the things that the Salafis will have to correct among themselves, is the character issue. You understand what I'm saying? And without addressing that issue, that stigma that's around that is not going to allow them to survive. You know what I'm saying? That whole issue of not believing in the dowry and polygamy and all that, that's people's personal understandings, but that shouldn't be confused with Islam or even with the Salafi Dawah. We have created a debating generation. Yes, sir. That's fundamentally, this has been I'm going to tell you myself. I'm telling you my own experience now. I'm opening up myself. When I went, before going to study, I used to have an apprehension of dealing with other Muslims on the knowledge thing. It was always, where did you get that from? And the issue that I ran into was I began to I went through this phase where I was like, because I was a philosophy student, so a lot of stuff, I was always like, where's the intellectual point here? Similar to what Yusuf was saying, about the issue of lack of critical thinking and stuff like that. And then I became more familiar with the hadith and so on and so forth and all that, and I began to understand why certain positions were taken. But it really wasn't until I went to go study and that it helped me to sit with scholars that just were like, relax. They taught me how to relax. It wasn't always, everything wasn't always an argument or being on the edge. And that's the thing that sometimes what I try to tell some brothers is very hard, because I myself have been through that experience, but I also have transcended that reality. So I sometimes forget that that's where brothers are at. But you can only come out of that situation, that argumentative orientation, is if you apply yourself to knowledge. You have to apply yourself to knowledge systematically, with teachers who love you and they take care of you, and they're not into that debate mode. You're more into understanding. This is one of the benefits of studying Ibn Rushd, at least in the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, even though it's advanced, is that Bidayat al-Mujtahid gives you a methodology for knowing, okay, well, you have minority opinion, majority opinion. This is why they differ. This is where they agree. This is where they disagree. And if you have that framework in your mind, it puts you at ease a little bit. But that's why I said, going back to the Quran, and the Seerah, at least as a basic foundation, so that you're at least cool with where your deen is at. How you understand the deen. The issue of a madhab or not following a madhab in ibadah, whether you follow fiqh sunnah or minhaj muslim or shafi fiqh or whatever, that's the issue that people have to systematize their ibadah at the basic level. So at the basic level, whether you follow Shaykh al-Albani or whether you follow this, okay, fine, we're not going to debate. You just go follow what you follow, but make sure that you're trying to struggle with your nafs and practice your ibadah. There's a lot of brothers that they won't go to the masjid. You understand what I'm saying? That was an issue that we had for a long time. There was a lot of brothers in the name of the Salafi Dawah, they wouldn't go to the masjid at all, period. And that's how can you claim to be following the Salaf or the Sahaba and you don't go to the masjid? You don't join the Jama'ah. And there's principles that even if you think the Imam is from Ahl al-Bid'ah, you can pray behind an Imam from Ahl al-Bid'ah. Like, what's the issue? So there's some things that implementing the ibadah and the issue of tazkiyat an-nafs and the issue of non-argumentation and all that has to be removed. Now, if there's with knowledge, you understand where all the controversy is at. Everything in the deen is not a controversy. You understand what I'm saying? Like the debate between saying the name of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in du'a or the name of someone that's considered a wali, that debate is not equal to where you put your hands at in salah. Whether you raise your, and where you put the feet at in salah. That's not an equal debate. There is not the same level of debate. but you shouldn't make them at the same level of debate. And that's part of the fundamental problem that, some people have made these types of debates in fiqh issues the same type of debate that we find in Aqidah issues. And then even the debate in Aqidah is not all debate. Like the issue of, for instance, tawassul or intercession. The only point at which there's a debate with that regard is when you start talking about the supplication and you're dealing with mentioning the name of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the awliya, or people who have been designated as awliya or whatever, because they have passed away. But if I go to Jomo or Lance and I say, pray for me, we're not debating that. That's intercession. That's tawassul. If I give away sadaqah, I give away $25,000 in sadaqah, that's a form of tawassul, to come close to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And so there's different ways to make tawassul, by deeds and by words. It's only that point about what is the role of the dead. And even in the Salafi Dawah, or the Athari overall, I should say, Shawkani didn't see a problem with mentioning the name of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Shawkani and Izzuddin Abdul Salam, there's debates on the issue, of if you're going to allow tawassul, to what extent do you allow it? Nobody disagrees that asking the Prophet directly, or asking a person in the grave directly, that's a problem. That's istighatha. That's now you're seeking the help from that person that is in that grave. Nobody really does that unless they have issues in their aqidah. Majority of the Sufis are not doing that. What they're saying is they're asking Allah by way of the standing of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with you. You know what I'm saying? And so that's the issue, that we have to understand where it is that there's agreements and disagreements, and only deal with the point of disagreement where it's at, with the right attitude and adab, but not make the whole thing a disagreement and the whole thing shirk and the whole thing bid'ah or the whole thing problematic. Yeah, the issue of the qibla, that issue happened amongst traditional brothers themselves even. That issue actually goes all the way back to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in New York City, where they had a conference. It was one of the last times when Bilal Phillips, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and a number of others, they had congregated. When it came time to pray salah, there was multiple qiblas that people busted out into, and they prayed. Everyone was looking for to pray with someone who was from their madhab. And so the southeast, northeast debate stayed for a long time, with northeast being the dominant position in North America, and the Caribbean. And so that's part of the dilemma that, some of those positions in the past, because of our development and our growth, you know what I'm saying? Yes, the Salafis are not one group. That's the reality, in terms of how they deal with things. You know what I'm saying? They have a unifying center, but they're not one group, and that they shouldn't be classed in the same thing. And so there's some spiritual points, some character points, some intellectual points, some social points. All of those things have to be considered in order for the Salafi Dawah to move forward. And there's brothers that they don't want to continue with that warfare mentality. And even the same thing, some of the traditional brothers need to tone down. They should stop imitating the takfir mentality, whether it's from the Ahbash or others, and tone that down. Because most of us, are in that process of learning. And so it's like, we need to be easy with each other. People are in the process of learning and growing, making mistakes and trying to understand. And there's a level of sincerity that's there. And so we shouldn't, take each other out. Yes. No. That part, Lance, wallahi, you and I are on the same line. I say that all the time. We forgot about the human being. Forgot about the human being. Like there's the compassion side is like almost gone. We've allowed the Christians to monopolize the concept that God is love. And so the issue of compassion and love is not there with a lot of people. You know what I'm saying? And I personally think that as long as that is the number one issue, none of us are going to move forward. None of us are going to move forward. And I especially tell the converts, like, you can't treat your family like crap, your neighbors like crap, people that grew up and took care of you like crap. You understand what I'm saying? And think that you're going to be able to move forward. There were some of our brothers that they made a video recently, a few months back. The compassionate Imam or scared to tell the truth. It's on YouTube. And it's like, you know, everyone is claiming that they have the truth, but how is that truth impacting the lives of others? You know, that becomes the dilemma. No. We have to learn how to be compassionate with people. The hadith of the man who killed 99 men teaches us 100% how we should be dealing with people. You know, if we're going to be condemning people, that's a problem on a regular basis. That doesn't mean that we don't speak out for what's true. But look, the Prophet ﷺ, what did he do with the man who urinated in the masjid? Or you want me to be more foul? He peed in the masjid. He pissed in the masjid. But I prefer urinated, but to show you the intensity of the situation. In the masjid, how did he deal with the situation? And that's what's necessary in order to understand, like, how was it that the Prophet ﷺ addressed a man urinating in a masjid? The hadith of the man who killed 99 men. How did you deal with that murderer? You understand what I'm saying? Who was the woman who gave provisions to a cat and was promised Jannah? What was her status? You know, who was the neighbor? Who was the neighbor of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was a non-Muslim and treated the Prophet like garbage on a regular basis? How did he deal with it? You know, so until we have the character of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we really can't talk about the Sunnah. You know, that becomes the issue. Yes, that's another issue. You know, that there are things that are differences of opinion. And you know, to be fair, is that basically they want unity. And they believe that unity will come by having the same aqidah and kind of being in one group, because everyone else is divided and they're the saved group. That's part of the dilemma, is attributing to yourself that you're the saved group and everyone else is in the hellfire. That's part of the problem. The hadith can be read another way. The hadith can be read as a warning to us splitting apart as an ummah. Right? And the sectarianism becomes extremely problematic. And brothers won't accept that. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of cool brothers across the board. And that's what we have to start emphasizing. You know, that, you know, we need to love each other. At the basic level, we believe in the same thing. At the basic level, we believe in the usul of Iman. At the basic level, we believe in the Quran. We believe in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's on issues, some points in Aqidah and some points in fiqh, that there may be differences of opinion. But until we start really treating each other like human beings and brothers, we won't even be able to discuss where it is that we differ on. You know, and why it is that we differ. We're scared to show that we love each other, because for whatever reason, somehow, look, if the Quran and the Sunnah emphasize that you have to love your parents even if they're kafirs, even if they're unbelievers, then what about the person that's a believer? That, you know, and to, you know, thinking that someone is in bid'ah and just keeping them aside to the side, saying that that's the only methodology of dealing with a person, like that's going to bring in is going to bring a community together, that's not going to really resolve the issues. What resolve the issues is good character, compete each other with each other in good character, and then let the ilm itself deal, you know what I'm saying, with the other issues. Let the knowledge deal with it. And if you feel as though is beyond your level, the person is not qualified or whatever, then just leave it alone. But it's your Muslim brother. Your Muslim brother has rights over you, and you have rights over him, and the same thing with Muslim sisters. But I'm going to end on that note. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.